The air in the grand hall of Stonegate Manor was thick with the scent of fading lilies and freshly uncorked champagne, a bizarre perfume for a house still draped in mourning. They thought she was a ghost already, a shadow to be swept aside on the march toward a $92 million fortune. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under the weight of expensive shoes, marching through rooms that used to be her sanctuary, already dividing up the spoils. But down in the cold utility space, her temporary exile, Beatrice Vance wasn't smelling the death or the roses. Her hand, steady despite the wobble of the folding chair they assigned her, reached into the pocket of her black sweater, grazing the crisp, notarized edges of the document. They didn't know about the paper. They didn't know about the ink. They thought they had erased her chapter completely, but in that moment, clutching the proof of her power, Beatrice knew the real story was about to begin. The last shovel of earth had barely been tossed onto Walter Vance's grave before the family converged on Stonegate Manor. It was not a gathering for mourning or shared memories, but rather for the feast and the fortune. Beatrice Vance, the widow, stood motionless at the foot of the sweeping staircase, still dressed in black, still carrying the faint scent of roses from the funeral. The hallway, which had been her refuge, now buzzed with loud voices and laughter, filled with the soft thump of shoes treating her home like a conquest. She gripped the banister, polished years ago by her late husband's own hand, and watched them proceed to divide up my life like vultures around a carcass. "This one's mine," her grandson Dean announced loudly. He moved swiftly, slapping a neon green sticky note onto the grandfather clock, then marking the luxurious leather armchair, and finally placing a claim on the cabinet that held the wedding china. Dean acted like a man touring a showroom, claiming prizes he had done nothing to earn. Nearby, his sister held up her phone, pointing it at the wall with an app open displaying blueprints and measuring lines. "We'll remodel this once she's out," she said casually, speaking to no one in particular. "A spa room maybe. Definitely better lighting." Beatrice remained standing. No one bothered to offer her a chair. No one paused to acknowledge her presence. Instead, Valerie, her daughter-in-law, materialized with a tray laden with champagne flutes. "We're celebrating Dad's legacy," Valerie said with forced cheerfulness. "He built an empire, and now we get to carry it forward. And clean out the ghosts," a muffled voice added, instantly triggering a burst of laughter. Beatrice found that her usual place at the dining table had been taken. It was replaced by a flimsy folding chair, dragged from the garage, wobbly on one leg and lacking any cushion. They directed her toward the mudroom, suggesting she would be more comfortable there, away from the noise. She complied, sitting in stark silence, facing a rusted utility sink, a mop bucket, and a broken broom. She ate the meager offering placed on a paper plate, dry chicken and overcooked potatoes. No one in the other room noticed her absence, and certainly no one looked in. From the house, the insults drifted into her corner. "This house smells like mothballs and death," one voice complained. "Let's strip the wallpaper and gut the kitchen." Dean entered the utility room, peeling off a bright orange sticker and confidently slapping it onto the sideboard right beside where Beatrice Saturday. "This one's mine," he declared, grinning as if he had just won a grand prize at a carnival. His sister followed, phone open to the room scanning app, turning slowly in place. "We'll remodel this once she's out," she repeated, considering a spa room or perhaps a new wine tasting nook. They did not bother to whisper their plans, nor did they grant Beatrice a single glance. She sat perfectly still, holding her tea with both hands to prevent them from shaking. "Walter always said she'd die before him," another relative guessed. "Guess that was his only mistake." The commentary turned crueler, cutting deep into her heart. "She built soup. He built an empire," someone added, and the laughter escalated. "Let her rot with the memories," a cousin sneered. "She doesn't even know what year it is. Can we keep her pension checks if we forward her mail for a bit?" her granddaughter joked. "God, she's half dead already," Dean remarked. "Let's just give her the garden shed and be done with it." Beatrice forced herself to take a bite of the cold chicken. It tasted like chalk, yet she swallowed it regardless. She did not speak. She did not argue. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and confirmed the presence of the document she had guarded for years. It was a bank memorandum, fully signed and notarized, dated 15 years prior. This document clearly declared her as a co-founder and early investor in the family trust. Her name was inked in blue, not black, a critical legal detail. They were utterly unaware of this truth. They had never asked. Back then, the company Vance Dynamics had been drowning, with bankruptcy looming like an unavoidable shadow. It was not due to high-powered lawyers or smart accountants that the company was saved. It was due to Beatrice. She had quietly sold every piece of heirloom jewelry she owned. Her mother's emerald necklace, her wedding bangles, even the brooch she wore on the night of her engagement party. She had confided in no one. She simply wired the funds and whispered a single instruction to Walter. "Use it, but don't ever let them know it came from me." He had kept that promise until now. In the adjacent room, she heard Marcus's voice. "We'll get the lake house. The boat's already under my name anyway." "The Lexus is mine," another relative called out. "Dad said I could have it last Christmas." "I want the Hermes scarves," the youngest family member insisted. "Even if they're hers, she's not using them." More laughter followed. They were dissecting her existence, dividing up her skin while she was still breathing inside it. One of them wandered into the mudroom, appearing slightly startled to find Beatrice still sitting there. He spoke casually, without concern or genuine interest. "There's bottled water in the garage fridge, maybe grab one." "You look pale," and then left without waiting for a reply. Beatrice remained seated for another hour as they picked apart the art, the land, and the shared memories. Someone had even begun dragging suitcases upstairs, claiming the master bedroom for an immediate weekend stay. One of the girls inquired if they might paint the room pink at some point. Eventually, the champagne ran dry, and the music was switched off, but the pervasive smell of greed still lingered, thicker than the dust clinging to the drapes. She rose slowly, her knees stiff and aching. She steadied herself momentarily on the edge of the utility sink and gazed out the small window above it. The roses Walter had lovingly planted along the driveway were beginning to wilt, neglected for days. She wondered if any of them had even noticed. Beatrice walked back into the main house. No one inquired about where she had been. Her footsteps were remarkably light, fitting the image of the ghost they already believed her to be. But she was far from done. She clutched the document in her pocket. It was warm now from the heat emanating from her palm. Let them drink, let them decorate, let them joke, she thought. The reading of the will was imminent, and she still possessed a pulse, a loud, steady, undeniable one. They viewed her as a burden, a shadow in their pristine story of triumph. However, there was a pivotal chapter they had consciously erased because it did not fit their pre-written version. The part where she had saved everything, and no one was ever allowed to know. 15 years ago, Vance Dynamics was collapsing. Beatrice vividly recalled the way Walter would come home late. His tie loosened, his hands visibly trembling, a silence hanging between them that felt heavier than any spoken words. He didn't need to confirm it. The bank had called, and the numbers confirmed they were dangerously close to losing everything. The clients, the contracts, even Stonegate Manor. "We just need one deal," Walter had muttered. His eyes fixated on the fireplace as if he could incinerate his shame. "Just one. If we can close with those investors in New York, it'll turn around." The problem was twofold. To secure the deal, he required significant collateral money that he lacked, and he possessed a deep, unyielding pride that he refused to compromise. That night, while Walter slept heavily, Beatrice made a profound choice. She retrieved the small velvet box from the back of her drawer. Inside were the last remnants of her dower, the diamond earrings from their wedding night, the emerald ring passed down through generations from her mother, and the heavy gold bangles she wore when she first arrived at the house as a young bride. Every single memory held weight, and she sold them all. She acted quietly, without asking permission or telling anyone her intent. The funds were wired directly into the company's escrow account the following morning. She gave him only one directive. Use it. Don't let them see you fall. Walter never asked where the substantial money originated. He simply did not want to know. That was his characteristic manner. Strong externally, but deeply silent internally. Beatrice, for her part, chose to remain behind the curtain. The deal closed successfully 2 days later. The investors signed and the company survived. They praised Walter, calling him a visionary and a self-made miracle. They never once called Beatrice. But that wasn't the most painful part. A month later she saw the new branding materials. Walter's face, bold on the front page, beneath a slogan that read, "Legacy built alone." She smiled faintly when she saw it, bit her lip and said nothing. Yet she remembered everything. She even remembered the night she wrote the crucial IPO pitch by hand. Walter was preparing for yet another critical investor meeting but had no idea where to start. The market was shifting and the entire industry was evolving, but he was still presenting old-fashioned ideas, pitching like it was 1995. So, after everyone in the house had gone to bed, Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and began to write. She meticulously outlined a multi-phase expansion strategy, basing it on emerging market trends. She projected shareholder value and developed a scalable growth model tied directly to supply chain reform. She had done this work before, in another life, before marriage, before children, before her business card simply read "Homemaker." That night, she signed the document with a name no one would recognize. A pen name, something harmless and clean. The next morning, she sealed the proposal in an envelope, stamped it, and mailed it to the office, ensuring there was no return address. Walter received it 2 days later. At dinner that night, he brought up the strange, anonymous proposal. "It's brilliant," he said, laughing in genuine admiration. "Even the handwriting looks familiar. Like yours." Beatrice simply shrugged and continued stirring the soup. That very proposal became the foundational blueprint for Vance Dynamics' IPO launch 6 months later. It successfully secured over $40 million in new investments. They proudly hung a plaque in the lobby, dedicated to his ingenuity, but Beatrice genuinely did not mind at the time. She told herself that the family needed one visible hero, and it was better to allow Walter to be it. She often reflected on the societal expectation for women, taught to gracefully disappear, to find pride in being the silent backbone while someone else claimed the face. She was taught that quiet loyalty was noble, that self-sacrifice constituted strength. But she now understood that prolonged silence inevitably leads to erasure. And now they were marching through her home, adhering stickers to her furniture, discussing their legacy, as if she had never been a part of it. They ridiculed her memory, questioned her sanity, and mocked her usefulness. They truly had no idea what she had given, what she had built, or what she had carefully concealed. Upstairs, hidden in her closet beneath a stack of linens that no one ever touched, was a specific folder. Inside was the original handwritten draft of that proposal, the ink slightly smudged from the restless tension of that night. Her pen name was inscribed in the corner. Folded neatly beside it was a letter from the patent office. This document officially tied the pitch strategy to a registered idea, registered not under Vance Dynamics, but under her name, Beatrice Vance. She had never once cashed the royalty checks. They arrived quarterly and had been for years. She didn't need the money. What she required was quiet dignity, the knowledge of her accomplishment, even if it remained unknown to others. But now, the family had clearly drawn a line in the sand. They had fed her shame, stripped her of her memories, and declared her dead while she was still very much breathing. Beatrice had reopened the folder. She had contacted her lawyer. She had hired a handwriting analyst. She had documented everything. Her purpose was not simple revenge, nor even purely for justice, but for the fundamental truth. When they gathered in that room and the will was read, and they heard her name tied not just to the family trust but to the core of the legacy they believed was exclusively theirs, there would finally be silence. "For once, I will be loud," she vowed silently, "and not one of them will be able to erase me again." The act of erasing her had been executed without eye contact. It was a Tuesday, just 5 days after the funeral. The house still held the faint, lingering scent of lilies and pine from the casket spray. The condolence cards lay unopened on the piano, as if processing even grief was too inconvenient. The family's energy, however, had shifted dramatically. The period of public mourning was over. Now came the sorting, the claiming, and the clearing had begun with Beatrice. "We've decided it's best," Valerie said, making no effort to lower her voice. "She can move to the small room downstairs." Beatrice blinked slowly. "The laundry room. Technically, it's a utility space," Valerie corrected her with a tight, brittle smile. "But there's room for a cot." Her bedroom, their bedroom, was already compromised. She could clearly hear laughter echoing from upstairs, the sound of drawers being pulled open, closet doors creaking. Someone was already rolling a suitcase down the long hallway. Her perfume bottles, her silk scarves, her collection of books, all were being hurriedly packed into large cardboard boxes. Not carefully, and certainly not lovingly. Just efficiently removed. Shuffling slowly toward the stairs, she saw labels stuck to the boxes. One read donation, another outdated, and a third simply old lady junk. They didn't even possess the decency to hide the labels. Valerie's husband, Dean's father, stood nearby, holding a clipboard and gesturing toward furniture like a man directing a moving crew. "That end table's perfect for the cabin," he told Valerie. "Put a sticker on it." A neon pink post-it note suddenly appeared, like a fresh bruise on the surface of the antique oak. "This one's mine," she heard. Beatrice watched in grim realization as her memories were systematically claimed, piece by piece. The wedding china, the rocking chair where she had nursed Marcus through croup as a boy, even the old record player they used for dancing during electrical blackouts, all were marked with the same cheerful, proprietary tag. Valerie turned to Beatrice, wearing that sharp, polished smile that served as her armor. "She doesn't need a room," Valerie announced to the group. "Just a bed until she's gone." A few awkward, nervous chuckles followed, but no one spoke up in Beatrice's defense. One of the younger boys, Liam, whom Beatrice struggled to keep track of, whispered something as he passed the kitchen door. "If we keep her address, we can still cash her pension checks." That drew more laughter. Beatrice did not laugh. She simply walked slowly, her knees stiff, toward what was formerly the laundry room. It smelled strongly of bleach and mildew. A single, bare bulb flickered unsteadily overhead. A plastic mop bucket occupied one corner next to a rusted utility sink. A simple cot had been shoved against the wall. There were no sheets, only an old moving blanket. This was now her room. Her small, pre-packed suitcase sat beside the cot. On top of it, a dented thermos and a framed photo, cracked slightly in one corner, rested. She picked up the photo. It was from their 30th anniversary. They stood together in front of the rose arbor, Walter's arm securely around her, her hand resting on his chest. Behind them, Stonegate Manor stood tall and proud. Back then, it truly felt like theirs. But that same photo had been forcibly pulled from the hallway wall and stashed away behind the refrigerator. Beatrice found it when she went to get a bottle of water. It was face down, shamefully wedged between a broom and a box of expired granola bars. Did they truly not even want to look at it? Did they believe she wouldn't notice its absence? Or did they assume she would simply forget? They forgot that she remembered everything. She remembered the night Walter carved their initials into the porch rail. She remembered the scent of cinnamon and vanilla every Christmas morning. She remembered holding Marcus as he wept over his college rejection letter, whispering, "You're still enough." She remembered baking elaborate birthday cakes from scratch, driving to midnight rehearsals, and hand-sewing the curtains that transformed this house into a true home. Now, however, she was reduced to a mere placeholder, a logistical problem, something they had to step over on their determined path to an inheritance. Valerie visited her cot later that evening. She placed a folded towel and a plastic bottle of unscented shampoo on the cot like an act of charity. "These are for you," Valerie stated. "We'll have dinner around 7. You can eat after we're done." Beatrice simply nodded. That was all she felt capable of doing. That night, While the family laughed over steaks and wine in the formal dining room, Beatrice sat alone on the cot. She peeled open a small tin of soup she had secretly hidden from the pantry. She had to use the end of a house key to open it, as no can opener had been left for her. "I built soup," they had whispered earlier, thinking she was out of earshot. "Walter built an empire, she built soup." As if providing nourishment wasn't a foundational necessity. As if warmth, care, and sacrifice meant nothing because the effort failed to show up in a stock portfolio. "I built soup, yes," she mused, "but I also built them." And now they were tearing her down with giggles, neon tape, and surgical polite cruelty that cut just as deeply. Later, when the house finally settled into silence, Beatrice returned to the refrigerator. She carefully retrieved the anniversary photo. She wiped the dust off the glass frame and pressed it tightly to her chest. "This was once my home. I was once the heart of it." They might believe they had successfully erased her, but they had only served to remind her of what she once freely gave, and what she was now capable of taking back. "And tomorrow," she whispered into the darkness, "tomorrow Attorney Reese calls, and I will answer with the voice they forgot I had." It had all started with an old, worn leather-bound folder. She had kept it concealed beneath a loose floorboard in the utility room, now her assigned bedroom, behind a crate of mop heads that no one ever touched. The morning after they had measured her small room for a future spa conversion, Beatrice took the folder. She walked 2 quiet blocks in the cold air to the payphone outside the local pharmacy. They had mistakenly cut off her cell service, but she hadn't forgotten the number. When Attorney Reese answered, she simply said, "It's time." He didn't inquire what she meant. He merely instructed, "Come in tomorrow." Attorney Reese had served as Walter's lawyer for decades, but what the family failed to grasp was that he had been Beatrice's lawyer first, long before the marriage had devolved into a performance, and long before she had faded into the background of wallpaper and casseroles. The next day, in his well-appointed office, she laid out the documents methodically, one by one. First, the joint trust certificate. Her name was clearly visible right beside Walter's, not listed as a mere witness or a dependent, but as co-founder and co-executor. Next, the investment agreement from the First Savings Bank of Newport Heights. Dated 15 years prior, it explicitly detailed the deposit. It was the money from her dower, her mother's heirloom necklace, and the gold bangles from her wedding chest. Everything she had quietly sold when Walter's company faced collapse. That some had bought him the necessary merger that saved his firm. She had never demanded credit. Her only request had been for him to survive. Finally, she slid forward a bundle of handwritten pages, yellowed with age, their corners curled. Each bore a familiar slant of cursive handwriting. "It's the original proposal," she said softly. "The model for the IPO." Attorney Reese's eyes narrowed slightly. "You wrote this?" She shook her head. "I sent it. I sent it with a pseudonym." He submitted it as his own. She vividly recalled that specific night. Walter had been pacing the den, a glass of untouched scotch sitting on the mantel. His board had rejected every draft he had shown them. Beatrice had sat up in bed after he finally fell asleep, pulled out a pad of paper, and wrote without stopping until dawn. By morning, her fingers were stained with ink. She never told him it was her work. She mailed it to their P.O. box with no return address. Walter had presented the proposal at the very next board meeting as if it were his own breakthrough. They approved it unanimously. It generated $38 million in revenue for him. And Beatrice had never uttered a single word. Attorney Reese leaned closer to the desk. "May I?" he asked. He pulled a file from his cabinet and retrieved a small envelope. Inside was another letter, typed this time, but signed E. B. Sinclair, the exact pseudonym Beatrice had used on the handwritten document. He compared the signatures. "Do you still write with this hand?" he inquired. She nodded. He immediately called in a specialist that very afternoon, a handwriting analyst from a prestigious university. They spent 2 intense hours examining the loops, curves, pressure points, and pauses in the script. Later that week, the analyst delivered a report. The letters were a 100% match. Crucially, the original work contained intellectual property clauses, specifying that copyright and authorship belonged solely to her, according to federal patent law. Since the idea and framework for the IPO were considered an invention and had never been formally transferred to the company, Beatrice could prove authorship. The royalty rights legally defaulted back to her. This represented millions, potentially much more depending on the ongoing duration of profit. Attorney Reese looked at her across the polished wooden desk. "You understand what this means?" Beatrice nodded, but then shook her head slightly. "I don't want the money," she stated. "Not all of it." "What do you want?" he asked gently. She folded the letter back into the folder and stood tall. "I want my voice back." For the first time in months, Beatrice allowed herself a true, small, knowing smile that started deep in her chest and curled its way to her lips. They had effectively buried her while she was still actively thinking. They had assumed that her quiet nature meant she was useless, that her love meant absence, and that her motherhood meant complete surrender. They thought she had faded like outdated wallpaper, but she had merely been watching and remembering. She had not forgotten who she truly was. She was the young woman who read complex contracts by candlelight while her husband slept. She was the woman who taught herself investment law using a borrowed library card. She was the mother who made soup, yes, but who also made smart strategic decisions. Now, as the family tripped over themselves carving up a house she had helped build, they were oblivious that the very land beneath their feet bore her name. The complete paper trail was already filed with the court. By the time they sat down for the will reading, everything would be ready. But first, she would let them finish their party, their ridiculous games, and their cruel jokes. Let them dance around the figurative ashes, convinced that she had already blown away with the wind. They had forgotten her, and that single act was their final, monumental mistake. At the lawyer's modern office, filled with cold glass walls and rich leather trim, Beatrice was made to sit at the end of the long table. In a folding chair, of course, because the family clearly could not bear to ruin the aesthetic of their tailored wool suits and designer handbags with her old lady aura. Outside, a heavy rain was falling. Inside, the atmosphere was akin to snow. Marcus, her son, sat nearest to the front, legs confidently crossed, his wedding ring freshly polished. His wife whispered something into his ear. He chuckled just loud enough for everyone to hear. "She'll be dead by next Christmas," he muttered, sipping from a complimentary espresso cup. "Don't expect a dime for her." Her granddaughter was texting discreetly under the table. Dean was practicing his signature on a legal pad. None of them made eye contact with Beatrice. Attorney Reese entered, briefcase in hand, and everyone immediately straightened up. He always carried an air of finality, the voice that signaled the end of any discussion. "Thank you all for being here," he began formally. "Today we are here to execute the final wishes of Mr. Walter Vance, as stated in his legally binding revised will." No one in the room seemed to notice the lawyer's subtle emphasis on the word revised. A few folders were distributed, and pages rustled. Then, Attorney Reese reached into his case and removed a small, silver voice recorder. He clicked it on. Walter's voice filled the room, slower than Beatrice remembered, slightly tired, but clear and calmly measured. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," Walter's voice instructed, "deduce $1 million per word." Silence. All breath seemed to leave the room as if a vacuum had been turned on. The voice continued chillingly. "You know how many he owes." There was a moment of profound, stunned stillness, immediately broken by the clatter of a pen falling from Marcus's hand. "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus demanded, sitting bolt upright. "That's not real. That's not in the..." Attorney Reese calmly held up one hand, silencing him, and slid forward a printed transcript. The heading read, Exhibit A, Verified PIU Transcript, Home Security System/Kitchen, 3 days after funeral. He began reading the listed statements, numbered sequentially. 1. She's still breathing. 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the will reading. 4. She built soup, he built an empire. Attorney Reese continued counting. We have 84 total recorded statements deemed ill of his mother, he concluded. That totals $88 million in deductions. He noted that some of the statements had been rather colorful. He turned the final page. The remaining $3,996,200 were subtracted as discretionary penalty, as per Clause 14C in Mr. Vance's addendum, he finished. Remaining inheritance for Mr. Marcus Vance. $3,800. Marcus physically leapt from his seat. This is insane. You can't do this. That woman, she's been a drain for years. Dad wouldn't, he would. He would, Beatrice stated quietly. It was the first time she had spoken all morning. Everyone in the room instantly turned toward her. Her voice was not loud, but it was unnecessary for it to be. Attorney Reese continued with unwavering calmness. Now, as for the primary beneficiary of the trust, the copyrights, and the remaining estate assets, Walter Vance has left them entirely to his wife, Beatrice Vance. He handed Beatrice a thick folder. It was heavier than she had anticipated. Inside were the deeds to the properties, the portfolio transfers, and the full rights to the intellectual property tied to the IPO model. A second, smaller folder held a deed to an apartment in Venice and a deeply personal, handwritten letter from Walter. The letter read, "Forgive me for the years I let your light stay hidden. I never forgot. I only hoped someday they would see what I did. If they couldn't, then let this speak louder than I ever could. You built this with me. Now let the world know your name." Marcus stood frozen, his face shockingly white. His wife began frantically dialing someone. A lawyer, perhaps a therapist or a priest. Beatrice looked around the room, which was filled with people who had already rehearsed their victory speeches on the drive over. She said nothing, understanding that justice requires no noise. It only requires the undeniable truth. Beatrice gathered her coat, the same old beige one they had called depressing last Christmas. As she walked slowly past Marcus, whose hand was clenched tightly into a fist on the polished table, she paused. She turned to Attorney Reese. "Will that be all?" she inquired. He nodded. "Enjoy Venice." But before she could leave, Beatrice turned back to face the family she had fed, clothed, shielded, and ultimately outlived. "You buried me while I was still thinking," she said, her voice entirely steady. "Too bad I had one more idea left." The silence that followed her statement was not merely awkward. It was bone deep. But Beatrice was not quite finished. Attorney Reese knew this. He motioned for a second separate envelope. "This," he said, unfolding the packet with deliberate, gloved care, "pertains to an intellectual property matter not previously disclosed to the family." He laid a series of legal documents before the room. 15 years ago, shortly before Vance Dynamics avoided bankruptcy through a game-changing IPO strategy, an anonymous proposal was submitted by mail. The business model presented in that proposal became the definitive blueprint for the company's public offering. He flipped to the next page. This patent was formally filed under a pseudonym E.B. Sinclair, assumed at the time to be a consultant or anonymous strategist. Marcus raised a skeptical eyebrow. What does this have to do with anything? It was Dad's company, his plan. Attorney Reese calmly turned to the third page. "It has everything to do with this, Mr. Vance, because we recently concluded a forensic analysis on the original drafts of that proposal, including ink composition, handwriting comparison, and timing of postal submission." He smoothly slid a framed certificate across the table. "The pseudonym was hers," he stated, pointing directly at Beatrice. "Your mother, Beatrice Vance." Gasps filled the room. Even the air seemed to hesitate. "This," he continued, holding up the certificate, "is the formal recognition of Beatrice Vance as the sole intellectual contributor to Patent 1-229-4157B, also known as the Vance stabilization model." He added that the patent now yielded substantial residuals through multiple licensing streams, amounting to $9.4 million annually. Marcus's wife, Valerie, clutched her scarf. Her granddaughter, Catherine, dropped her phone. But, Marcus stammered, visibly shaken, she made soup. She mended socks. Attorney Reese permitted himself the faintest hint of a smile. Yes. And she saved your father's legacy. He pulled a folded letter from a separate envelope, slightly aged but still crisp. Before his passing, Mr. Vance left this personal note, sealed and notarized, he announced. He cleared his throat and read it aloud. She found the cure before the world knew it was broken. She kept quiet because she loved me. I asked her to let me take the credit because the board wouldn't follow a woman. But I knew. Always knew. This company is her mind on paper. A sharp intake of breath came from the back of the room, the realization hitting someone that everything they believed they knew had just cracked like old glass. Marcus muttered something under his breath. What was that? Beatrice asked, finally meeting his eyes fully. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time that morning. I didn't know, he said, his voice now quiet. I didn't know it was you. Beatrice didn't offer an answer. She had spent years erasing her name so her husband could be seen as whole. She had kept her name off the plaque, burned the drafts, and even mailed the final model from a different zip code. But she had never forgotten. Attorney Reese passed the room one last page, a ledger detailing every quarterly payout the patent had earned since its inception. All funds were signed over to a holding trust, untouched and waiting. It's yours now, he said, handing her a black folder trimmed in gold. Catherine spoke up, her voice surprisingly small. So we were living off her mind all along. No one replied. They were too busy staring at their own stunned reflections in the office's glass walls, silently wondering how they had missed the most important mind in the entire house simply because it was wrapped in an apron. Beatrice stood up. No one made a move to stop her this time. I drew the map, she stated quietly, buttoning her coat. And you all thought it appeared by accident. No one moved as she walked out. The same woman who had been summarily dismissed as fading wallpaper had just reminded them that empires do not only rise on the backs of men. They rise on the backs of women, too smart to be seen and too strong to be erased. The letter from Attorney Reese gave the family 48 hours. It was signed by the executive, stamped by the court, a legal deadline for the ungrateful to vanish from Stonegate Manor, the house they had so carelessly trampled. By the following morning, the frantic packing had begun. Boxes thumped heavily down the hallway. The laughter, for once, was completely absent. Catherine didn't speak a word. Her eyes were red, but her hands moved rapidly, sweeping jewelry into velvet cases that no longer belonged to her. Marcus approached Beatrice. Please, Mom, was all he could manage before his voice completely broke. He was the man who once sat on her lap to read the words on the cereal box, who held her hand during thunderous storms, now reduced to a trembling shadow begging for a second chance. Beatrice didn't cry. She felt she had shed enough tears already. She simply said, "You spoke first." The will simply listened. Marcus slumped back as if the revelation of the truth had struck him harder than any physical blow. Outside the kitchen, Beatrice heard Valerie shrieking, "You're heartless. She's heartless." Beatrice stepped calmly into the doorway. "No," she stated. "I gave you a house. You gave me hell." Valerie opened her mouth again, but Beatrice was done giving her any attention. She walked slowly through the house, gently, as if reintroducing herself to a place that had become sacred again. The hallway still carried a faint, clean smell of old lemons and sunlight, but it was no longer cluttered with arrogance. She passed the guest room, now mercifully emptied of its spa-room fantasies and ambitious Pinterest plans. A small sticker on the vanity mirror caught her eye. "This one's mine." She peeled it off, folded it once, and tossed it into the trash receptacle. Room by room, she methodically gathered all of them. The blue one stuck to the antique dresser, the yellow tag on the armchair bearing Walter's initials, even the neon green one placed on the silver frame of their wedding photo. "This one's mine," they had boldly asserted. Not anymore. Not ever, truly. They simply believed that kindness was consent. In the dining room, where so much callous laughter once lived, Beatrice paused by the grand piano. Someone had placed a sticker there, too. She closed the lid gently. "That one was always his," she whispered. "And he gave it to no one." The house felt utterly still. Not empty but clean, as though it had been holding its breath for far too long and could finally exhale fully. Outside, she stepped onto the back porch. The beloved roses were gone, uprooted the previous summer to make space for a planned wine tasting corner. But the pomegranate tree still stood crookedly beside the window, its roots stubborn, its bark split from too many harsh summers. And there, near the base, was the tiny rose bush Beatrice had planted when Marcus turned 5. Only one brittle stem remained, its thorns bare, its leaves curled and forgotten. She knelt down, her knees pressing against the cool tile. The ground was dry, bone dry. She fetched the watering can from behind the shed. It was half-rusted but still serviceable. She poured the water slowly, listening intently as the thirsty soil drank. "We bloom again," she whispered to the stem. "Not because they believed it, but because I never stopped tending the roots." The wind suddenly picked up, brushing gently across the porch, carrying with it a profound silence, the kind that only settles after a house has been fully reclaimed. Stonegate Manor was no longer haunted by greed. It was finally, unequivocally, hers. Beatrice sold the house the following spring. It was not an act motivated by anger or revenge, but simply because it no longer felt like hers. Some places accumulate too much painful noise, and no amount of dusting or renovation can quiet the cruel words that have been spoken inside the walls. With the sale finalized, she moved into a small penthouse overlooking the ocean in San Diego. It was the kind of place featuring wide windows, flowing white curtains, and the constant gentle hush of waves, always just a breath away. No squeaky stairs, no malicious whispers behind closed doors, and absolutely no stickers claiming what never belonged to them. Just peace, and enough room for her to finally think out loud. The royalties from the patent continued to arrive, steady and quiet. But she didn't need all of it. So Beatrice initiated something new. A small foundation with a long name, the Women Who Were Erased Fund. It was deliberately not flashy, lacking a gala or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It had only a bank account, a clear mission, and sufficient resources to offer scholarships, grants, and, most importantly, recognition to women who had built silently and been forgotten loudly. She intimately understood that feeling. She knew how much it hurt to whisper brilliance into someone else's spotlight. And she knew precisely how good it felt to take that spotlight back for herself. Outside her new front door, she hung a wooden sign. It was hand-carved from a piece of the old oak tree that she and Walter had planted together years ago. The sign read, "This house was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence." It made the mailman chuckle every time he passed. Inside the penthouse she kept very little, just essentials and a few precious memories. One of them was a faded drawing, taped to the fridge, rendered in crayon on construction paper. It was drawn by her youngest grandson, Liam, years before the family taught him how to roll his eyes at her. The drawing showed a stick figure of Beatrice wearing big glasses, standing next to a giant light bulb in bright purple scribble. It read, "To Grandma, you think better than Google." She had almost thrown it away once, back when they repeatedly told her she was losing her mind, that her memory was slipping, and that she should simply sit, smile, and remain silent. But she never forgot that drawing, and she never forgot how to think. They had buried her in their assumptions. Old, tired, fading, irrelevant. But Beatrice was none of those things. She was patient. She was watching. She was remembering what they desperately wanted erased. And most importantly, she was still thinking because she had never ceased. They thought she was fading, but she was merely waiting for the opportune moment to think out loud. Beatrice Vance was far more than a mother, more than a wife, more than a woman standing silently in the background. She was the mind that built the map, and when they tried to erase her, she simply rewrote the ending. Silence may be golden, but the truth, she knew, was priceless.